When this woman was burying her daughter, Nancy, she saw a blister around her lips, but you won't believe what happened next. Sarah, like any devoted mother, dreamed of providing the best possible life for her daughter, Nancy. She had worked tirelessly to lay a solid foundation, ensuring her daughter would have every opportunity to succeed. As the proud owner of a thriving beauty bar and several popular restaurants in the village, Sarah envisioned passing them all down to Nancy one day, securing her a bright and prosperous future. All Nancy needed to do was prove she was ready to take on the responsibility. Unfortunately, at 21, Nancy didn't see it that way. She often behaved like the overly pampered child she had always been. Tragically, it would take a devastating incident for her to realize that life isn't always a bed of roses. Meanwhile, Sarah quietly endured her daughter's indifferent attitude toward her future and career. Sarah held onto the hope that Nancy would eventually outgrow her carefree ways. Still, her daughter's approach to relationships often kept her awake at night. Sarah firmly believed that a woman should marry and start a family early, but Nancy had a different perspective. She felt she was still young and wasn't ready to be tied down by marriage or children. "I will get married when I want to. It's the 21st century." She screamed at her mother one night, slammed the door to her face, and rushed into her room to chat with her boyfriends. You see, Nancy was a pretty woman, and she often turned heads wherever she went. She also enjoyed the attention she got from men, so she had about 2 or 3 boyfriends, but she didn't want anything serious with these men, at least not yet. And even if she would get married someday, it would most likely not be with any of those guys she was presently in a relationship with. However, each guy had a role to play in her life. Nancy met Joseph about a year before, and she was immediately attracted to him. He had a great physique, but he wasn't as tall as she would have liked him to be. Nancy initially ignored any doubts. A few days after meeting Joseph, she slept with him, and while things seemed perfect at first, her feelings soon began to fade. She disliked his controlling nature, and even his height became an issue. However, she stayed because of his lavish spending, expensive gifts, luxury vacations, and weeks in 5-star hotels kept her around, along with their physical connection. Meanwhile, there was Charles, her source of genuine love and care. They had met at university, and Charles, now a nurse at a local hospital, was utterly devoted to her. He would do anything for her, even risk his life, but Nancy took his love for granted. She didn't like the way he would always confess his feelings to her whenever he got the chance. She hated the way he was desperate for attention and affection. Worst of all was his submissive nature. Why didn't he ever say no to her? Why didn't he act tough sometimes, just a little? Why did he say sorry whenever she offended him? I mean, all the time. Can't you just pretend to be tough sometimes? Can't you just pretend to be a real man? She screamed at him one night, asked him to get lost, and ended the call. But the next day, Charles came over to her house with her favorite chocolate, and Nancy, who was feeling a bit sad that morning, decided to use Charles's presence to get over the way she was feeling. After all, he wasn't all that bad. He could crack jokes that could have her rolling on the floor laughing. He could even make lunch and maybe teach her some dance steps. So she welcomed him with a big smile and took him to her room. Just like she had expected, Charles taught her some dance moves, and afterward, Nancy suggested they play a game of truth and dare. You see, Nancy loved flirting with men, and she enjoyed seeing them go crazy about her, but little did she know that what she was about to do would backfire on her. A few minutes into the game, Nancy dared Charles to kiss her. The young man couldn't believe his ears. He began stuttering, and his heart began racing very fast as he leaned toward her to kiss her. Seeing his reaction, Nancy smiled. What she thought would be a brief kiss turned into something deeper, and she found herself clinging to him, asking him not to stop. They ended up making love. For Nancy, it was unplanned and meaningless, but for Charles, it was special and strengthened his bond with her. 2 weeks later, Nancy discovered she was pregnant and regretted her choices. Worst, she didn't know who the father was. Days before being with Charles, she had also been intimate with Joseph. Believing Joseph was responsible, she called to tell him the news. To her surprise, he stayed calm and expressed excitement about becoming a father. So he asked her to come over to his house the next day so they could have a proper celebration. The next day, at about 7 p.m., Nancy went over to Joseph's house, and after welcoming her, he poured her a drink. A few minutes after taking the drink, Nancy became dizzy, and she felt like her stomach was on fire. "What did you do to me?" Nancy gasped. Just then, Joseph confessed to her that he was happily married with kids abroad, and he didn't want any more children, at least not with a loose girl like her. Nancy didn't even hear the last part of his sentence. She passed out. When Joseph was sure that there were no signs of life in her, he carried her in his arms, tipped out to the garage, and dumped her in his car boot. Then he zoomed off. About 30 minutes later, Joseph arrived at the village outskirts. He got down from his car, lifted Nancy out of the boot, and threw her on the floor. "That's what happens to crazy and senseless girls like you," he said, rushed into his car and zoomed off. The next morning, the village was thrown into pandemonium when Nancy's body was discovered. When Sarah heard about the tragedy that befell her daughter, she passed out. That evening, a quick burial was organized, and when the casket was opened, Sarah noticed something that made her scream. Firstly, she saw a blister around Sarah's lips, and that was when she suspected that her daughter could have been poisoned. Looking closer, she noticed that Nancy's chest was moving up and down. Filled with fear and hope, Sarah quickly grabbed her daughter's hands, and she felt a pulse. "She's alive! She's alive!" Sarah screamed. Nancy was immediately rushed to a traditional healer, and he gave her an antidote that reversed the effect of the poison. Luckily for her, she didn't lose the baby. When Joseph heard that Sarah had woken up and that the police were looking for him, he disguised himself as an old man and quickly fled the city. A few months later, Nancy heard a knock on her door, and it was Charles, staring at her with so much love in his eyes. "I'm sorry for everything you've been through. I'm so grateful that you're alive," Charles said, his eyes resting on her baby bump. "I don't care whose child you're carrying. I love you, and I want to be with you. Please, give me a chance." Moved by his words, Nancy, now humbled by her bitter experiences, apologized sincerely for how she had treated him in the past. Overcome with emotion, she pulled him into a warm embrace, holding him tightly. "I'm not a perfect woman, but I'm ready to learn and do whatever it takes to make you happy," she confessed. Nancy finally admitted that she had been playing a dangerous and costly game all her life. She couldn't believe she had nearly lost an incredible man like Charles because of her unrealistic expectations and fleeting desires. She had come to realize that perfection doesn't exist, and that sometimes what we're searching for is right beside us, even if it doesn't come in the exact form we imagined. Nancy eventually came to understand that what truly matters in life is finding someone who will love us unconditionally through life's highs and lows. In time, Nancy went into labor and gave birth to a baby boy who bore a striking resemblance to Charles, revealing him to be the child's real father. I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this story, so please don't hesitate to share your insights in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and found it engaging, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more similar content. Feel free to share this video. Take good care of yourselves, and I'm excited to connect with you in our future videos.